Today we got a presentation by Alexander Schmidt-Catran from the University of Cologne. He will present a recently published paper on migration web support to Germany. I think it might be interesting for us from the substantive perspective, but also from the methodological perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me in this kind of introduction. As you said, I'd like to talk about immigration and welfare support in Germany. More precisely, the question of whether immigration undermines public support for the welfare state or for redistributing resources within the welfare state. Now, this is pretty obvious. I'm going to start with an introduction. Now, why is it important to understand welfare attitudes or public opinion towards welfare? Well, first of all, it's a whole research field, and you can spend your whole career in that field. But apart from that, understanding public opinion might help us to understand how welfare states will develop in the future. Because at least in representative democracy, you would expect that public opinion somehow matters for actual policy. So that's why it's important to understand public opinion. Now, in this paper, we are interested in the effect of migration on public support for the welfare state. And this whole research field originates from US-American research, where a number of scholars argue that this comparatively low level of redistribution that you find in the US can be explained by the high level of ethnic heterogeneity. And the idea is that people don't like to share their resources with outgroups. And if you have a society that is divided along racial lines, then you don't gain the necessary solidarity to support a system of redistribution within this society. Now, in Europe, this has raised the question of whether this is some form of American exceptionalism, or whether we can expect something similar to happen in Europe. Right? We're facing migration right now, massive migration, and we will certainly face more migration in the future. So the question is whether this massive migration might push the continent towards more American levels of spending by undermining the public support for the welfare state, and then through the process of representation to lead actually to lower welfare expenditures in the European welfare states. So that's kind of the research question, and this is how you can draw that in a figure. The basic hypothesis is migration has a negative effect on public support for the welfare state. So this is what we are interested in. Now, if you look at the empirical evidence, you will find that the results are rather inconclusive. So these are just three examples here. There are scholars who say, well, there's actually no substantial relationship between migration and support for welfare. You find scholars that say, well, there's a negative relationship, as this hypothesis states. But you will also find scholars who say there's a positive relationship. So we don't really know what's going on. Now, what we try in this study is to address methodological problems of the previously published papers. And what we argue is, well, first of all of the papers are essentially cross-sectional, so they base the estimates of this effect on a comparison between different units. And secondly, most of these papers, with the exception of Maureen Ayer's paper, they use countries as the relevant level at which they measure the share of migrants or the share of foreigners. So essentially, all the previous papers are two-level cross-sectional multi-level models. Well, then, on the one hand, by using cross-sectional estimation techniques, you run into the risk of having a bias due to unobserved heterogeneity, and then if you use countries, this problem kind of becomes even worse, because you have typically a rather small number of countries, like 10, 15, 20, maybe 13, so that's the numbers that these people work with. And then we don't have the ability to control for an adequate set of control variables, because the degrees of freedom at the country level are rather limited. So these are the two problems that we want to address in this paper. Okay, now, if you think about the theoretical foundation of this hypothesis, or more precisely, the microsociological foundation, well, then we will find that maybe these inconclusive results might also be due to the fact that we don't really know what we should expect, or that we can expect different outcomes under different conditions. So if you want to explain the relationship between migration as a phenomenon at the macro level and public support for welfare, well, then somehow you would have to explain how migration affects how individuals perceive migrants, how attitudes towards migrants change if migrants come into a society, and then you would have to explain how that relates to attitudes towards welfare. Now, already at this stage, we have two competing hypotheses. The conflict hypothesis says prejudice is reduced if people come into contact with migrants. And then the conflict hypothesis says, well, if this is not really a good contact, well, then prejudice might even increase if people come into contact with migrants. So already here we don't really know what is happening, but actually, as I read the literature, it seems to be the case that an increase of the migrant stock leads to an increase of negative attitudes or prejudice towards migrants, or an increase of threat perceptions. Now, more important is this relationship here, how the perception of migrants relates to attitudes towards the welfare state. And then this kind of American idea is that if migrants come into a society and they are culturally distinct from the native population, they will be perceived as a cultural threat. And then people start to, well, lower their support for redistributing resources within the society. Yes, they don't want to redistribute resources to these outgroups. And so this is kind of the idea from this American research. And then, on the other hand, a quite general result from welfare state research is that people who are exposed to economic risks typically demand more distribution or more welfare simply as a compensation for increased economic risks. So whether you would expect a positive or a negative effect might depend on whether migrants are first of all perceived as a cultural threat or as an economic threat. Okay. Now what's kind of obvious from the literature is that the economic conditions should somehow moderate the relationship between attitudes towards migrants and attitudes towards the welfare state. So if migrants are perceived as an economic risk, then if the unemployment rate is higher, this becomes even more salient, right? On the other hand, if they are perceived as a culturally distinct group with which there is a conflict over resources, then a high unemployment rate makes this conflict over resources even more salient. So the idea is, whether the relationship is positive or negative, it should become stronger the higher the unemployment rate. That's the idea. So in the end, we come up with three hypotheses. The first says there is a negative relationship between the number of foreign wars and support for the welfare state, and this is termed the conflict hypothesis. The second hypothesis states exactly the opposite. The higher the number of foreign wars, the higher is native support for welfare. This is based on this idea of protection from increasing economic risks. And then the third hypothesis is based on this idea of the unemployment rate, making this more salient. It simply states the higher the unemployment rate, the stronger is the effect of the number of foreign wars on native support for welfare. Okay, and then we also argue in the paper that we can probably expect a nonlinear effect. So if migration rates are really low and migration starts to increase, the effect should be stronger compared to a situation where already a large migrant stock lives within society, then the change in this stock shouldn't be so salient to the people. This is kind of what we probably see right now if you compare East and West Germany. So these reactions are particularly strong in East Germany, where actually almost no migrants live. Okay, now then I just come to the internal methods part. I told you in the beginning that the problem with previous research from our point of view is that all the studies were cross-sectional, and most of them all but one actually, use countries as the relevant contextual units. And we wanted to address both of these problems. So the first idea is instead of using countries, we use regional units. So this is, we do not compare across different countries, but across regions within one country, within Germany actually. Now, theoretically, that should make sense because if people come into contact with migrants and that somehow affects their perception of migrants, then it's probably better to measure the share of migrants as close as possible to the daily experience of the people. Right? Then if the share of migrants varies within a country, if there are regions with a lot of migrants and regions with less migrants, then you also have less measurement error if you measure the share of migrants at the regional level as compared to a country and where you simply take the national average. So that would be a methodological argument. Now also by analyzing data from just one country, obviously you don't have a problem of unobserved heterogeneity between countries because you just have one, right? And then also by taking regions, we have much more contextual units as the typical analysis that were previously published. So in fact, we have 94 contextual units, which then just gives you more statistical power compared to a multi-level model that compares 20 countries. Okay, and then the second idea is to get a longitudinal estimator. Right? I said all the previous papers were cross-sectional, and what we want to do is to get a longitudinal estimator. Now the big problem is that literally all available surveys that ask for web latitudes are cross-sectional. There is no panel study that asks for web latitudes. So how can you get a longitudinal estimator using cross-sectional data? I never explained to you what we just did to get a longitudinal estimator. So we went to the Secure Data Center of the GESIS in Cologne, and we got great support there, by the way. And we took data from the IWOS, the German General Social Survey, from 4 ways, 1994, 2000, 2006, and 2010, and combined that with regional level data on the share of foreigners, the unemployment rate, and also GDP per capita. And so we have 96 of these so-called Raumordnungsregionen, which are statistical units used by the Statistical Office in Germany. This is how they distribute over Germany, and we combine data at this regional level with cross-sectional data from German General Social Survey. Well, we did that at the Secure Data Center because this detailed information is not available in the public inside of the IWOS. Now what you see here is it's actually true that the share of migrants that is not evenly distributed across Germany, but there is a strong variation of the share of migrants. So this is just to back up my argument that if you just take the national average, you have a lot of measurement error. Right? You neither should describe the situation in Eastern Germany adequately nor in Western Germany. So we measure the share of migrants at this regional level. Okay, a few words about variables, although that is not really important, but the dependent variable in the IWOS asks people whether they want a decrease in the benefit level, want to keep the benefit level, or want an increase in the benefit level. So more or less benefits. So this is our dependent variable, and then the two central independent variables are the share of foreigners. We actually would have liked to have the share of migrants, but you don't get this data as far back as we needed it, and the unemployment rate. So what we looked at is the correlation between the share of foreign ones and the share of migrants, which for 2011 we can calculate. So for 2011 we have both figures, and we find a correlation of 0.92. So I would argue that shows that the share of foreigners is a pretty good proxy for the share of migrants. Okay, I won't talk about the control variables. This is more important here. So what we have in the end is a data set that consists of about 8,000 individuals, 94 regions, and 4 waves from the German General Social Survey. And in our population are native Germans, which we define as having German citizenship on the one hand and being born in Germany on the other hand. This is what you typically do in this research field because you're interested in the effect of migration on natives' welfare support, right? Because natives are the ones who are willing to vote. Okay, so well, this is kind of a pooled cross-sectional data set. Cross-sections pooled together, and the big question is how can we model that data, or how can we model it in order to get a longitudinal estimate? Now this is a small excursus from a different paper in which we looked at the random effect structure if you have these pooled cross-sectional data sets. So you have a data set with some geographical clustering, in our case regions, with some clustering in time, survey waves or years, and then you can also have random effects for the combination of a region and specific survey wave. So this gives you, in total, 8 possible combinations of random effects that you can have in a model that is used to model this data structure. Now we have 6 types here, and actually you find all of these specifications in the literature. So you find people that use 2-level models in which they have a random effect only for country year specific combinations. Then you find people who use a 2-level model with a random effect only for countries. You find other people yet that use 3-level models or also complex 4-level models. Now, I don't want to go into detail here, but what we show in this paper is that actually these structures D and F, they give you unbiased standard errors. All the other structures give you too optimistic, meaning too small standard errors. We show that by using means or simulations. Now this is a literature review we did within that paper, and everything you see here in red is actually a mistake of some kind. So in the end, we find that more than half of the papers use random effect structures that might lead to biased standard errors. Okay. Oh, this is also what you see on this slide. So more than half of the papers do not adequately model this random effect structure for this pooled cross-sectional data type. And that probably leads to a downward bias in the standard errors. And what we recommend in the paper is you should either use this structure, meaning individuals being nested in combinations of geographical clusters and waves or years, and this being nested within the geographical clusters, countries or regions. Or you can use this even more complex structure which has a cross classification at the top level. But actually, if you're interested in variables that describe the region or countries or the geographical clusters and that vary over time, like the unemployment rate, for instance, varies over time, then this structure is a very good choice. We say, well, you should control for year fixed effects to model the time trend, which in this structure is included in the random effect structure. Anyway, so you should use this structure. And that's kind of the end of the excursus. So we assume with this ionosphere pooled over 4 waves, we have this 3-level structure. Individuals nested in combinations of regions and years, and this nested within regions. Now what's very nice about this structure is that although your individual level data is cross-sectional, the levels 3 and 2 of this structure, they constitute a pendant structure, right? You have units, and within these units, you have repeated measurements. What that means, you can actually use this intermediate level to model variation over time within regional units. And this is what you typically do in the analysis of panel data. A fixed effects panel analysis means to get rid of all variation between the units and use only variation within units over time. And we can do the same with the regional level variables in our data structure. So these regional level variables are term Z here, while individual level variables are term X. And we can decompose the effects of the context units into a so-called between effect, which is based only on variation between the regions, and a within effect, which is based on variation within regions over time. So if you go into the analysis of panel data, you will recognize this is what you typically call a fixed effects transformation. It creates a variable that gets rid of any variation between the units. Okay. Now, in our specific context, the dependent variable is ordinal failed, so we use an ordinal product mixed effects regression model. Well, we use product because Klaus recommended we to use the product model instead of the logic model. Now, typically, social scientists use logic models. But actually, in regression, you will find that this decomposition into within and between effects, it will provide you consistent estimates for the product case. That can be shown, where for the logic case, it cannot really be shown, because the results don't really differ. And you get pretty much the same results, but here you can prove that you will get a consistent estimate from the product regression. Okay, so we have an ordered product mixed effects model with 3 levels, and we decompose the effects of the region level variables into these 2 components, within and between regions. While the individual level effects, they are just cross-sectional effects. Okay, well, then let's have a look at the results. Never show regression tables in the presentation, so I want you to have a look just at this one number. So basically what you see here are all the contextual effects. And well, when we introduce the share of foreigners into the model, we find a negative effect between regions and within regions, but only the effect within regions is of substantial size, and also the only one that is significant. So we do find a negative effect of the share of foreigners on support for welfare, demand for more welfare, and what we do find a positive effect of the unemployment rate, which is what you would expect. I just told you quite general result is that if economic risks increase, then people demand more welfare, and this is what you can see in this effect of the unemployment rate. Now, in the next step, we check whether this effect of the share of foreigners is non-linear, and we do actually find that is the case. So what you see here is a marginal effect plot having the effect of the share of foreigners on the y-axis and the share of foreigners on the x-axis. And what you see is that the share of foreigners is quite low, and you have this strong negative effect, and it diminishes higher the level of foreign losses. And it might actually even become positive. We don't know. What we have observed is a maximum of 18% migrants, but maybe if we would have observed regions with 20 or 30% migrants, then this effect might even turn into a positive one. We don't know. What we find in this sample is, while it's strongly negative with the share of foreigners, it's really low, and then it diminishes in size. Now, in this model, we interact the share of foreigners with the unemployment rate, and I have again a graphical presentation. So again, you see the effect of the share of foreigners on the y-axis and the unemployment rate on the x-axis. And what you see is, well, if the unemployment rate is really low, then the effect is not significantly different from 0, but if the unemployment rate increases, this effect becomes significantly negative. Becomes stronger. And this effect, or this estimate, is also based on the within region variation over time. Now that in the final model that's now quite complex, it's a 3-way interaction between the non-linear effect of the share of foreigners and the unemployment rate. And what we found here is, well, if you have a median level of foreigners, this is 7%, this is the mean of our sample, but then we will have this effect, which is not significantly different from 0 if the unemployment rate is really low, but then becomes negative if it's higher. Now, in regions with a really small share of foreigners, you have this stronger effect. And so if you compare the y-axis of these two graphs, you see this effect is much more negative. It's minus 0.6. Right? So in regions with a really low share of foreigners, a high unemployment rate leads to a particularly strong negative effect of the share of foreigners. While in a region with a really high share of foreigners, about 12% in this example, the effect is no longer significantly different from 0. So this problem I describe here is particularly relevant in the initial phase of migration. Then we can expect this strong negative effect on support for the welfare state. And that, as I said, becomes more salient, or the effect becomes stronger if the unemployment rate increases. Okay, well then I come to the conclusion. So we argue, and I hope I have convinced you of that, that this is rather robust evidence for a negative effect of the share of foreigners with the support in Germany. Right? Compared to other studies, it's a longitudinal estimator, so it should be closer to the true causal effect as compared to a cross-sectional estimate. Now, I showed you that this effect is particularly strong in the initial phase of migration, and that it's moderated by the unemployment rate. So now the question, of course, is, does this relationship hold in other countries? Can we generalize this result? Now, in the paper we argue Germany is kind of a least likely case scenario for this effect, because the German welfare system, in the German welfare system, your benefits are strongly bound to your contributions. Right? So what you get out of the welfare state is essentially what you pay in. This is at least true for, say, your retirement benefits. Maybe less true for healthcare, but also in healthcare you have a relationship between what you pay in and what you get out. So we argue that if the argument is that people don't want to share their resources without group members, then Germany is a case where it's unlikely to find that effect, because essentially what people get out is what they have paid in. So a foreigner that gets unemployed but hasn't paid into unemployment insurance, he won't get any unemployment benefits, right? So maybe people don't care whether foreigners come or not, because, well, they don't have access to their resources. So in the paper we argue that if we find this effect in Germany, it's likely that we will find it also in other countries. Now, I'm not really convinced that that must be true, obviously, and what I do right now is to create a data set which will allow me to do this analysis with European regions, this kind of longitudinal analysis. Now, another really important question that we couldn't address in this paper is whether there are really these two contradicting effects, this cultural threat and this economic threat effect, and whether they work against each other, and whether, in some circumstances, the economic threat might be more salient, so that migration would lead to an increase in demand for redistribution. We didn't have any variables which would allow us to measure this threat perceptions, so we were not really able to address these theoretical issues. Okay, well, and then, of course, and that's the last thing I want to say, the question is whether this public opinion really translates into real policies. So whether people will vote for parties that promise to decrease the benefit level, and whether these parties will actually do that, that's a completely different question. So what we have showed here is that public opinion reacts negatively to the inflow of migrants. But whether that really translates into policies, that's a different question that you need to answer in, well, probably not one, but a lot of papers. Okay, that's the references, and then I'd like to thank you very much.
Thank you for the interesting presentation. It's very interesting to see the form of the presentation. particularly in this room. Open up for questions.
Okay, you've used, well, I was a bit confused at some point whether you use foreign borns or foreigners as the indicator for ethnic diversity. Could you just briefly explain that?
It's foreigners.
Foreigners, so it's not foreign born.
It's foreign born.
Yeah, exactly. So that was just a bit confusing at some point, but that's clear then. And I mean, in the German case, I see that it's a relatively good indicator because the changes in naturalization laws have been fairly recent, looking at the data that you have. But when you look at this at a cross-national level, that will become much more complicated, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any data that span over time frame for foreign bonds across countries in a consistent way? Is that possible?
We talked about that before. I talked a bit about what I'm doing. I tried to do the labor force survey, in which you have at least the country in which someone has been born.
And then you can just aggregate using the labor force regions.
Yeah, use the labor force regions and then the share of foreign borns, and whether you will match that with the ESS data, and then hopefully have a good indicator.
And that would still, I think, underestimate effects, particularly in those countries that are ethnically heterogeneous without much migration. Because you have, well, I don't really know about Belgium, right? I mean, how do welfare state attitudes work in a country that's kind of so defined by language, or other countries where you have strong regional inconsistency, say Spain, countries where there's a lot of conflict about material resource distribution in the country as a whole. So if you look at foreign bonds only, this will only measure the migration-related heterogeneity, but not the overall ethnic heterogeneity. So, I mean, you could say, well, you still have conservative estimates at the end.
Yeah, that's probably true, I mean, the problem with ethnic heterogeneity is you have these indicators for ethnic fractionalization, but if you have a country like Belgium, the ethnic heterogeneity doesn't vary much over time, right? So this is kind of, when we start to observe Belgium, it has already been an ethnic heterogeneous country, and then it stays like that. But certainly that is true, but I think that you kind of underestimate the effect if you only look at migration and not at ethnic diversity.
Because in the United States, I think it's more the long-running racial divisions that are important rather than recent migration flows. Although maybe will contribute, but I think maybe it's even some of it.
I mean, that's really a good argument. The main point in this paper was to get this longitudinal estimate, and then probably if you take one of these ethnic fractionalization indices, you won't find anything simply because it doesn't vary over time. I guess, but I would certainly try.
So how did you measure the welfare state attitudes?
That is, where is it? Here. This item. Some people say that the level of benefits is too high and that it should be retrenched.
Okay, but do you think that, so what does it include, what does it exclude? So the welfare benefits, so unemployment benefits, are these welfare benefits?
Yeah, I mean, that is a really good question. I mean, this is a really, really general item, right? And it probably would be much better to ask people, do you say unemployment benefits should be increased or decreased? We don't have that. And we don't really know what people think if you ask this item. So
how is it in German? Could you just say, because this is ALOS, right?
Yeah.
How does it say in German welfare benefits?
Sozialleistung. So probably Sozialleistung is not so much associated with pension benefits, but with maybe with unemployment benefits, certainly with what is today Hartz IV or So and this is, if people understand it that way, that's good for our argument. If they would think about their pension, that wouldn't be really convincing.
But the question is, who is affected by that? You see, if you think there's a competition on the labor market, this is one thing. yeah, then more or less the low qualified stranger are affected. Yeah? If that is parts 4 or something like that, yeah, then the entire population is affected. Yeah? So I think that makes a difference. And a more general question, perhaps, are you sure that this ethnic heterogeneity, also in the case of the United States, is that at the core of the exceptionalism, or is it that people, or that in the United States they have not controlled their borders? So if everyone who wants can come in, yeah, then I'm not responsible for the other people. Yeah? And therefore, so let them come in, but that's it. Yeah? And then they have to be responsible for their own fate. Yeah? So that would be a different aspect. Yeah? And also, what I was thinking about, is it only something which is negatively directed against the foreigners, yeah? Or the present discussion, if you take that, yeah? So unqualified asylum seekers are coming in, yeah? So some say, okay, this is not a good idea, yeah? At least they do not help on the labor market, yeah? Let the higher educated come in, but not the lower educated, yeah? So irrespective of asylum laws, so, yeah? But if you have that, then the next question is, could you have an exchange with Turkey? Yeah? So Turkey might send as many of the educated Syrians as they want, yeah? But they get back the criminals and those who depend on social welfare benefits, yeah? From their Turkish population. So that would be an entirely different kind of exchange. And the next step would be, so how do we get the ethnic German lower class out of here? Yeah? So basically what started with migration, yeah, but what comes out of it is something entirely different. Yeah? So if people see that it is not ethnicity, but it's social class, which might be more close to the problem, yeah, then that could happen. So then what the Linke is trying to do, yeah, might entirely be the wrong thing, yeah, or ineffective.
Yeah, okay.
So the speculation, of course.
Yeah, speculation for a lot of points, but
there's potential alternative explanations for all
yeah,
things.
I mean, certainly what you should find, and I plan to do that with the next paper, is that this effect also interacts with individual characteristics. For instance, if you are a low-skilled German, then this economic competition should be more important than, say, if you are a high-skilled, high-earning German, then you are the one who is paying into the system, right? So there should be, this negative effect should be more pronounced for the high-income Germans, which would pay for these new incoming migrants, but not really compete with them on the labor market. So you should find something like that to make this a convincing story. I would agree. And then also, I mean, in reality, and this is what I tried to say on the last slide, I don't believe that we would have a much lower benefit level in 20 years due to this mechanism here, because what the Alternative für Deutschland is doing, for example, they don't say we will lower the benefit level. They say if you vote for us, then migrants won't get any benefits. Right? So you have a political actor that says to the people, we can exclude them from our benefits. So why then should people want to lower the benefit level? Now, of course, it's not that easy. You cannot easily exclude them. At least once they have German citizenship, there is no way to exclude them from assessing our benefits. But I mean, how this really translates into policy, that's probably a really, really complex issue. And I don't believe that you can get at this using quantitative statistical methods. So you probably would have to really analyze how politics work, how these different political actors use arguments that somehow relate to this issue, and how they frame it to the public. I guess that's probably more important. And we actually, without to show that, have a paper in which, it's this one, here we compared across different countries, and we got a measure of the saliency of migration issues in the political discourse. So how much parties talk about migration issues, or negatively about migration issues. So basically, right-wing parties. And what we see is that the effect of having a negative attitude towards immigrants on having a negative attitude towards welfare, it increases the more salient political parties make migration issues. So we kind of argue only the political actors create a link between these two issues, then we're likely to find such an effect. And that's, I guess that is true, but still, it would be really complex to model all this in a statistical or quantitative model, I guess.
Maybe this was already entailed in the previous questions and I just misunderstood, but is there a way to further differentiate within the immigrants where they actually come from? Because I guess there is a difference in perception whether they come from Japan or France or the Middle East or Africa or wherever.
Yeah, that would be great. We don't have it in this data. Again, you get it today, you get this data, but for 1994, which is when our time series started, well, then you don't get this data, you just have the foreigners. Now with this new data set for Europe, I can do that, and that's certainly a really important argument, because if it's true that you have this economic threat and this cultural threat, then if migrants that come into society are very similar culturally, then this economic threat shouldn't increase, right? So this, this cultural threat shouldn't increase, but the economic threat should be the dominant mechanism. While if they are very different, well, then probably this cultural threat should dominate. I have another paper here, which tries to address that using a single country. What we have here is data from Switzerland, which is in a way very interesting because Switzerland has two huge immigrant populations. Germans on the one hand, and then a lot of immigrants from ex-Yugoslavia. So the Germans, they are culturally very close. Well, that's what we argue, Swiss people always say they are, but there's probably no group that is culturally closer to Swiss people than the Germans, maybe the Austrians, right? And then we have this group which is culturally more different. And what we try to see is how these groups affect the perception of economic and cultural threats, and how that relates to welfare attitudes. And first, we do find that there are these two competing effects. So economic threat leads to an increase in demand for social expenditure, while cultural threat leads to a decrease. And what's really interesting here is where we do find for economic threat an effect of 0.26 from Yugoslavian immigrants and of 0.25 from German immigrants. That makes sense, right? So these are probably a bit more high-skilled, but both of these groups might induce economic threats. But then if you look at the cultural threat effects, we have 0.25 from this culturally distinct group and 0.20 from Germans. So it's a bit smaller, but we would have expected this effect to be zero. Right, so, and now I come back to your question. If even Germans in Switzerland are perceived as an outgroup culturally, then maybe it doesn't matter how similar these migrants are, you still can have this effect. But then on the other hand, there might be a special case where Swiss people all day are talking about how different the Germans are.
Exactly. That was your earlier slide with the effect from the rhetoric in the media, right? And the national discourse, which in Switzerland is very often also targeting Germans. I mean, if that was not the case, maybe this would be zero.
Yeah, we don't know. Yeah. We don't know, but that was the idea here, to the nice thing about the survey was that they asked for different ethnic groups, but that's a problem that's somehow idiosyncratic to this case. But well, in a way, you should expect that a country very close group doesn't have this negative effect. And this somehow indicates that it might be not that easy to survey, because culturally close must then actually mean really, really close and not just somehow similar.
Yeah, thank you. I think this research strategy using regions instead of the national context and making it longitudinal, that's a great idea. I got a question on it nevertheless. I mean, much of the difference in these regions is between East and West Germany. So, I mean, you for sure ran analysis separately. So does this hold when you only use West Germany? And the second question is, it comes also to this effect of the news and the TV. I mean, right now with this refugee crisis, I could assume that how many people really come to Mannheim doesn't have an influence on the perception of persons, because you see it on TV that they all come. So perhaps, so this would be also a question on your opinion. Would this hold now under this refugee crisis? Would you find this effect as well? And my last question would be, I mean, you talked about this American exceptionalism and so on. So I thought now in Europe we had several times where we had mass integration, but we are still somewhat different from the Americans. So the question is do you think that these effects are lasting effects, or is it it's cyclical? I mean, now with the refugee crisis, everybody talks about it, but in 3 or 4 years, we get used to it, and then it goes down again. So what do you find is this?
Yeah, thank you. 3 very good questions. Now, for this East-West difference, now this within estimator, which is the only one that is significant in our analysis, that's in a way independent of East and West Germany, because it just uses variation within a particular unit, whether it's in East or West Germany. So the estimate you find is not based on these differences across regions. But then, of course, this nonlinear effect, kind of the lower end of this effect, is mainly identified through Eastern regions, and then this upper end of the effect is mainly identified through West German regions. So we saw that maybe this nonlinearity is actually that you have a different effect in East and West Germany, a stronger effect in East Germany and a smaller effect in West Germany. So what we do find if we run the model only on West Germany is we still find this nonlinear effect. For East Germany, we also, if you look at the signs, find this nonlinear effect, but this nonlinearity is actually not significant. But we do find negative effects in both East and West Germany, and for West Germany, we even find this nonlinear effect. So I would argue, the East-West divide doesn't really affect our estimates. And of course, we also control for West or East Germany in the model. Now, what was your second point? Whether the media, right? Now, I mean, of course, today probably the media is much more important for how people perceive migrants than their immediate neighborhood, I guess. Luckily, that really wasn't the case in this time frame, but still I would say it would be a really nice addition to this model to have a year level, so that actually would be this complex model here, which would allow you to have the media discourse as a variable at the year level. And I would agree that probably today, if you do such a study now, media discourse is much more important than the actual numbers in the immediate environment, I guess. So that should be done. Alexander Schmidt-Catran and the second author, and they just had a nice paper using Spanish data where they did exactly this. They had the media discourse on migrants over time as a level in their analysis, and showed that it's really important. It really affects how people perceive migrants. But then on the other hand, now for this hypothesis to be true, there must not be a direct connection between these two issues, right? You don't need an actor, the media, who explains to people you should know the welfare support now because all these migrants come in. But the idea is that this is really a long process over time, that simply the solidarity or the cohesion within a society decreases if it's not homogeneous. And then over a long period, where people might have lower support for redistributing resources because they don't live in a society that perceives itself as one group. So I guess now you will find completely different effects. So if you really will analyze the effect of the media discourse on welfare issues, I don't know whether you will find this relationship here. So this is really like a long-term effect over many decades probably. While what's happening right now is, I don't know what you will find, but certainly the media affects people, but I don't know whether it has an effect on attitudes towards welfare, more maybe on the party preference or something. And I just said that when I ended the talk, the Alternative für Deutschland is promising, well, if you vote for us, then we'll just exclude these migrants from the benefits. So that's probably what you would find then today, which then kind of makes this effect irrelevant. So if people think they have the opportunity to just exclude migrants, there's no reason to lower welfare spending.
Okay, I'm going to go up to the Alternative for Deutschland actually, because this triggered a different point, but they also sort of have this two-phase party platform, and the one that is given to the higher status ones is that we just get rid of reduce the welfare state completely across, which goes back to the point you made earlier about this interaction with high income or we could just call them high status, really having this strong effect because they don't face a trade-off with needing their own welfare. So I think this is a good example of this unfolding in practice, the rise of the IFD. And to support that point, sorry for self-promotion, but so Marine Enger and I just got this paper published. But something that you might not notice about it is that we have an interaction like the one you described, and it is, well, incomes are certainly missing, but for high educated, the effect is very strong, the immigration effect, and then for low educated, it's not so strong because exactly because of this trade-off. We think that they also need their own material security to worry about. So just this supports this. Okay, but back to the question that wasn't triggered by the IFD. In East Germany, are the regions, the change in the period you have from 94 to 2010, is the change in foreign rates roughly similar across all Eastern German regions?
Well, that's not that easy, that question. I mean, in a way, it's similar across all German regions because basically in all regions, with just a few exceptions, it rises. Right? That's what all regions have in common. There are almost no regions where in 2010 you have less foreigners than in 1994. There are some, like 5 or 4. Well, and then you have in some regions which have an increase of say 4 or 5%, which is quite large, and then other regions which have an increase of 0.5% points. So there is some variation in how these regions attract migrants. But I would say the most striking feature is that it just increases in all regions.
Okay, yeah, maybe you don't have to look at the data to get that point out exactly, but I guess that the reason I'm asking is because my suspicion about East Germany is that you have reunification, and so you have this sort of rebuilding of one national group, so to speak, since this is about kind of group boundaries. And so you have that in kind of the 90s, and then you have maybe achievement of this. And if they all have a similar rate, well, different from Western, that's the key point, then my suspicion is that it's capturing what is just happening over time, which is the media or just discussions of, oh, immigration is threatening our national group, and this is increasing over, especially through 2000s, probably beyond the scope of there. That's just, that would be, so then it's not about having immigrants in your local region at all, but about this over time national group attachment where they, people in places where they maybe never see immigrants even are feeling the presence through the media.
It's a very interesting question.
So the short answer would be that we control for the general time trend in our analysis just by means of dummy variables, which capture the general time trend. Right, so the general time trend across Germany we cannot explain what we find here, but then maybe you could say, well, there's a different time trend in East and West Germany. I'm not sure whether we have modeled that in this complete model, but we had it in when we ran it separately for East and West Germany, then we have a specific time trend for these regions, right? So the short answer would be the general time trend cannot explain that. But I guess that there are some differences between East and West Germany which are not captured by our analysis. And we would, of course, be controlled for a dummy variable, right? But then at the within region level, the only control that we have is GDP per capita. And maybe you could control more there to capture differences in development of East and West Germany over time. Maybe some political variables or media discourse variables. Yeah, I guess that's a good point.
And unemployment also helps to some extent. Unemployment probably also helps.
Yeah, I mean, unemployment is in there.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It benefits this argument.
I guess as you have more than two measurements, you could not, maybe it doesn't work because it depends on the variance across time to look at individual slope models. As you can compare differences in the changes across time within the geographical units. So for the Olympic would be.
Yeah, that should work only if you have individual and dependent data, right?
But we do this with the geographical.
That should be possible. Yeah. I think the model didn't converge. I mean, I tried to analyze more than effects, but then we have this street level or a problem model, and I think I tried that to have region-specific slopes, and I think it didn't converge, if I remember correctly. I mean, that model already ran like 6 hours, I think. Sata. Yeah, of course. You should know any other software that needs Solo.
And I think, I don't remember if you cited or if you know it, but this Brian Burgoon and group research, others research, it does use the labor force survey to occupational level migration rates. And this is because migrants go into different specific occupations, and they find
they explain the positive effect as it's only when you're threatened in your occupation, and I think that's very convincing. And you could use that to argue that all these others who have found the positive effect, which is you find the opposite, that may be a big factor for them. So I like that paper very much. Well, maybe methods aren't as strong as yours, but at least
actually, what I just do in this paper for surveys, not only to measure the share of migrants at the regional level as they did at the occupation level. And then, what I attach to their paper is that I have variance over time, and then again can identify my estimate using within occupation variation over time, which I guess should be convincing. But I guess I would like to say that they found.
You would think so. The only drawback is you have to rely on this one question in the ESS, the one that's repeated.
Yeah.
Which is about reducing income.
Yeah, which is
not. This is a bit on the side of the welfare state's core functions, but although now when they do 2016 ESS, then you have two ways, two good welfare state questions. So.
Yeah, the two ways. Yeah, I guess I will use this redistribution item, which is not ideal.
Any more questions? Thank you for the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Interesting.